Super progressive. What is good? Haven't had an interview in a while, but it's because we've been building up to our very, very special guest today. We are joined by a true legend when it comes to the history of progressive underground music. An artist who is still active today, and I'm so stoked to talk with him. Today, our guest is Cass. Man, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm really good. Thank you. I mean, just considering some of the people you speak to, I think we just have to die. I'm super appreciative, but I haven't really, I think been involved full bore for a while. It's nice to be back and kind of um, doing what I love to a certain extent, but it's really very kind of you. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm super honored to have you here today. As I've learned about the progressive underground scene, specifically probably the late 90s, early 2000s, people have built over time this soundtrack to that era of their life, and undoubtedly your tracks make up a lot of that soundtrack. So I'm really excited to speak with you about your career and current projects as well. First thing I want to ask is where are you calling from? What is our secret lab? Because today it's something that I see associated with your name. You know, I'm signed up to your newsletter
Yeah.
and all our communications. It seems like our secret lab is associated with you, but what's going on there?
So our secret lab is, kind of when I took a sort of sideways pivot from music full time, I wanted to still do something creative. And so from my perspective, I wanted to have a creative agency that could, you know, maybe move back into music at some point, but also would allow me to explore the other aspects, but whether it was events or films or anything of that nature. So it's a creative lab. We do work for small companies and very, very big companies, and often places in between. So it's kind of a very enjoyable day job. It's like if your side hustle was your main gig.
Yeah. Well, it's awesome that it seems like it's still an artistic expression or creative expression of sorts for you, while still being able to, pay the bills and make a living for yourself.
Yeah, I think the key thing is that it's reminiscent of when I was within music, and I see it now, with people if they ask, or my kids or anything like that. I'm like, just being involved in and around what it is that you love is already the thing. If you really love what it is that you do, you look at let's say take for example like Bicep. They didn't know that they were going to be, in the Guardian's terms, the kind of natural successors potentially to Underworld or the Chemical Brothers when they started like a blog from Belfast about music. But they were like, that's how you start, because it comes from a true place. And I was just going out, when I started, and just, was like, I just really want to, I want to do this. Like, I love this, what they're doing. It feels incredible, whether it's musically, the DJ aspect of it. So yeah, I think it was just born out of that. I was like, if I can have my cake and eat it, if I can do a job that I genuinely, really love, then you don't mind doing the job, right?
Absolutely. And with all that said, you're still producing music. Probably right when this podcast is released, it'll fall in line with your Gothmania EP being released on stripped recording.
Yeah,
Um, it's awesome. Can you talk to us a little bit about that track?
yeah. I think it's it. If I remember back to why I stopped making music, I think it became a committee in your mind of who's going to play it, what's it for. When that aspect of it becomes preeminent, I think it kind of makes being creative for the joy of it, and then allowing it to be what it is, allowing people to, because my thing always was the great part about it, the bit that you enjoy, is when you do it, you hope that it's great, you like it, but then you share it with others and they fill it with their meaning, right? So when, if you take some of the things that we wrote, like when I've played at gigs and people have come up and they've had perception tattooed on their finger, or they had it under their wedding ring, went to Tel Aviv, and it was like, I'm like, And I say it as the person who was, partially responsible for it. I'm not sure it's a great wedding song, but if it's that meaningful to you, it's unreal in the real sense of the word. So same with Gothmania. I think that the key thing is you're not the arbiter of taste. You're doing something that you love. If you do it meaningfully, then you hope people will gravitate towards it. And I think I've been lucky enough to, over the last sort of 6 months and all the rest of it, be able to crystallize that kind of process again, so that I can spend some time in the studio and hopefully, even though I know whatever the figures are, like 5 million records being, released every minute, but you want to kind of add value and be an enjoyable part of a conversation that's shared with others, whether it's the people that you like who might potentially play your music, or people who reach out and say, hey man, this is really great, I really enjoyed it, glad to hear you release a banger again. There's nothing, is it kind of narcissistic? But potentially, but there's nothing greater than have someone reach out about something that you made and say, I enjoyed this too. So as I say, I'm lucky enough with the day job, and I've tried to shuffle it around so that I can make music again. I'm lucky enough to be working with a really, just 2 or 3 really, really talented producers who help with that process. And yeah, it's enjoyable, and that's what I remember being the best of this.
I think a lot of people are going to enjoy the track. And you said, there was this committee in your head when you stepped away from this music.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, this specific area, this small corner of electronic music that we take up, people take the music very seriously.
Yeah.
On all fronts, the clubbers, the producers. And I think that's why the music itself has endured all the different ups and downs of the electronic music scene. It's always, the progressive style has always been there, in part because I think people take it extremely seriously. But have you found that maybe as you've gotten older, you've gotten to quell that committee in your mind, or find fun in the production process where it may have gone very serious at some points?
Yeah, I think that if it's funny, it's to identify that, and progressive is such a wide word. It goes from being like a positive affirmation of your chosen musical selection to literally like the dirtiest of secret, where you feel like, taking Beatport as an example, they need other niche names to disguise the fact that you write progressive house, but heaven forbid you're not in the melodic techno. It's like it sort of goes up and down on a sine wave of whether it's like acceptable or not. And I think, but it's interesting because when it's done well, if you listen back to some of those kind of CDs and everything else, yes, I will admit everything appears very fast. Everything's north of 130, but if you listen to some CDs or some of the mixes that were done, that stuff still feels relevant, feels very now. The artistry, the way that they put it together, I mean, for some of them in that late 90s, it was the beginning of the Pro Tools era, but it was still like, even if you were a really good DJ, there was still that, is this 1 record or 2 or 3? Is it a re-edit? That kind of mystery showed always to me like a great skill set. I enjoyed, it's like magic. I know but I like having the card be tucked underneath my watch and not knowing it was there. It feels like that's like when you're out and you're just like, God, this just feels like. We always used to say, can you imagine, like if there were only 100 records in the world, and you gave those 100 records to Tenaglia, or you gave those records to Hanan, or you gave those records to Sasha, like, and then you had a blindfold on, you'd know who was playing them. Right. And that's quite unique. It shows a skill set that speaks to the value of the person at the controls. And I think in terms of why I started to come back is I'd been out to a few things and just seen people who I knew really, really well, or had come across or had been meaningful in my career. So I said it on a recent podcast, was I saw Hanan at like Coco in London, and just he was like, he was absolutely banging it out, but it was just brilliant, like the energy in the room. And I was like, there's no dissipation, there's no feeling of it was as if it was his first gig. And the same when I was in Sydney for the day job, and went to got some tickets. Was just stood behind Sasha for a couple of hours, like at a race course, where he was on the fringes of a race course. And it was as if literally, people use this phrase all the time, like he DJ'd like his life depended on it. There wasn't a minute where he wasn't working every audio aspect of every single record stretched out across 2 hours. And I was like, and this guy, I mean, if you're talking about, if Malcolm Gladwell wants to buy in, how many hours have people like this been doing it? And they're still turning up, still really respecting people in the audience who you could probably play last year's music and it'd be fine. Just no half measures. And that to me was a real, those two things, I think, seeing those guys and just thinking, there's no excuse. There's no excuse. People here of this caliber still respecting the art form and turning up and really delivering.
When we look at the state of electronic music today, and what was going on in the late 90s, as someone who was only an infant during the late 90s, I was born in 1994.
Thank you.
No, one of the glaring differences to me is that there are no DJs or producers in terms of young talent coming up today. Everyone is being required to be a DJ producer, DJ/producer. One title, where if we look back at the late 90s, kind of all the way up to the early 2000s and everything before, there were these talents that excelled. They were two different skill sets. There was the DJ and then there was the producer. And sometimes they'd come together in a production duo when you would see something like Bedrock with John Digweed and Nick Muir, or Way Out West with Nick Warren and Jody Wisternoff.
Yeah.
But how do you think that benefited the music in the late 90s in terms of its quality and its lasting power?
Well, I think the interesting nature of it is a lot of that stuff, it's melodic in terms of, some of the elements of its structure, obviously. But there's, I think there was a real confluence of kind of those DJ mechanics. Like everyone used to laugh about, the start of certain sets or whatever, that they'd last, 5 minutes before anyone hears a beat and this and that. So there was a sensibility of the musicality of the moment. Like it doesn't need to only serve everybody being on the same level, whatever that meant. And we're going to have it now. Like that feels more like an aspect of something like Tomorrowland, where, like my brother was the founder, or still is the founder and CEO of Resident Advisor. So his influence on dance music is a lot larger than mine. And, so obviously over the last 20 years, he and I have constantly had discussions about, the nature of electronic music, what it means, how it's changed and everything else. And I think you notice that potentially back then, I think from a technology standpoint, that knowledge and those expertise that you brought from understanding what worked well on a dance floor, what you felt that you could get away with in terms of the length of records or the size of a breakdown, or you brought that knowledge, brought it into a production environment that normally potentially would have been, missing that key element. Whereas now, because everybody can see everything everywhere, and technology empowers you to make things that sound like things, there's a lot more just in that middle ground. There are a lot of records that are like a lot of other records, but, I think there's a reason why Sasha hasn't, ever touched Expander again, because he's like, because he's always looking forward, or however you approach it, or anything of that nature. But it's like, it's like when like Oasis could only get close to the Beatles once, right? And they've got all the knowledge, all the skill set, all the albums. Everyone owns the White Album on three different, et cetera, and they could only get close once, right? So I think it's born out of that, the magical element of, going out felt a lot more kind of integrated into what you loved. Like people loved to dance. The music was instrumental on it. You poured over magazines like Music and Mixmag and DJ to see people's charts that were already 4 weeks old, and it didn't matter. And, you know, just there was a lot more commitment. And so from a DJ perspective and from a production perspective, things were just probably more complex to manifest. You know, the story I told again on this other podcast of how I had 2 acetates of Perception only, because they were like 80 quid each to cut. And I wanted to give one to Lee and one to Sasha. And I was at the Bonaparte, which is why the B-side to that record is called Three Tyrants of the Bonaparte, because it was him, Craig, and Lee. And I gave it, so we gave one to Lee and I gave the other one to Sasha, and then I left it underneath the booth because he hadn't arrived yet. And then I said, oh, well, I've got to go. Left, it was packed, 6 deep on the outside. And it was halfway up Notting Hill, because we used to live at the top of Notting Hill, and realised I hadn't given it to him. And I was like, that's a ball ache. And it was a real sliding doors moment. So then you go all the way back down. It's like hailing a cab in the age of Uber. Like, you're having these discussions with people, like, why don't you just resend it to him on an email? You're like, well, no, because I've got an 80 quid acetate. It will only last 20 plays anyway, underneath the bench in the Bonapartes. And now I've got to go. It's 6 deep outside. I've got the security are like, no, you've left, you can't. So I make my way in and and then, you know, give it to him. He's like, yeah, brilliant, fine. Puts it in his box. And then goes to Ibiza to mix Global Underground. And the legend, as I understand it, is he finds it, likes it so much that literally pulls something else off to put that on. Like, so at any stage, and even before that, even more amazingly, we lost the whole of Perception like before we got it cut. Nothing at the whole thing. And I was like, I went back in the evening and was like, we were like, and I normally, like, Pete was on the tools, and I said, look, I'll redo the arrangement, which is why I cheekily quadrupled the break, which was why he had an argument. He was like, sure, no one's ever going to play this. I was like, just let me do this. You lie down on the sofa and snooze like my normal role. And so I just kept making it longer and longer and longer and longer, and said, this is what I like, is I like that the first break is almost like a blind, a misdirect, because you go, oh, it's massive, this must be what the record's like. And then you go, nah. So again, all of these elements, all of them were, you had to commit during all of these potential moments where you could have just been like, whereas now, those kind of things are greatly reduced. Everything stores in the cloud. It's easy to send things to these people. It's easier to make. So whilst I like, as a father of 4 children, the empowerment of digital technology to remove the barriers of access to creativity, the downside is that it allows those who don't really have a sense of commitment to feel like they're part of an art form that previously rewarded dedication, collaboration, and artistry. And I have no answer for you as to whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, because there are still fantastic records being made now that I'm sure that were far easier than if they'd been made in 1996. But, you know, I think then those people who offered something like, you know, I think just, you know, even some of the Way Out West records, a breakbeat, you know, there's a remix. It's so funny. Like, there's a remix that Nick Warren did. Sorry, a mix, a single mix. Like, I remember it now in my head, like as if it were yesterday. And my hairline tells you it was not yesterday, right? It was on his Essential mix, I'm pretty sure. And it was a piece of music, I think, from like the film Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. And then he put a breakbeat record under it, which I hunted down. I still own it today. That original vinyl that I did as a result of hearing him play it, which is a track, it's by an act called Mondo Scuro. It's one of my favorite breakbeat. And the way he put them together, so there's this beautiful pan pipes, very cinematic, and then this ridiculous breakbeat came underneath. I remember what that felt like viscerally 30 years after he did it. And that's just one mix from one DJ. And I can hear it in my mind and I can feel, I was like, what is happening? And it was on the radio at 1 a.m, because that's when the Essential mix was on. And again, you know, I think that kind of experience where you have to hunt out that and then you are rewarded with something that speaks to you, that potentially, when everything exists that ever's existed in the palm of your hand, maybe that's lessened.
Yeah, I think what I'm learning hearing your stories is that in the analog world, the stakes across the board it feels like the stakes are higher. Like you making sure Sasha got that acetate in his hands. There was no backup option. You redoing the arrangement for perception the night
Yeah,
before it's due. There's no other option. Like there's no backup save file. There's
because it
the
was on an
stakes are so
Atari
high.
ST.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was on an Atari ST, and all that was there was the 16 bar loops down the middle. And
Can
I
you
remember the feeling of that. We'd gone for Mexican in Notting Hill, came back, Pete and I, and just woke the computer up and nothing. I remember that feeling.
when you
We were
when
both
you
like, we were sort of like, I'm not going to bother. And I do remember just going, I left feeling so good about where we were. Let's just try it again. Let's just try again.
can you bring us through kind of a play-by-play of the first half of the production effort on that, like where, because it's a track that I think people put up there right along with Expander in terms of defining not only a progressive trance genre but an era of music. When when that track was in its infant stage and you were working out the idea, what was kind of what was kind of at the foundation of the idea that you were working out that became perception?
Well, I think the first thing to remember is I'm a producer who works with others who do the producing.
Right.
So when like I like to come with a firm idea or a clear suggestion or a clear avenue where we're going to go and how we're going to do it within the boundaries of not usually having my fingers on the tools, apart from maybe some, hammering away with one finger at the keyboard or laying out arrangements and all the rest of it. So everything comes through that person. And Pete, I think he had a really strong musical history outside of producing the kind of trance music, where I first discovered him at Flying Rhino Records when I became the label manager there. But he also had a sensibility of, like, he would be a musician in his own right, pitching for like sync music and everything else. So the beauty of that is that it's a real sort of fertile combination, that because then you get somebody who understands dance floor mechanics, but not necessarily from the kind of viewpoint of what's happening. So it feels fresh, or it does when you add in my kind of DJ wish list. And then also, if I say what I'm looking for is this, I need you to confine this. I want you to open that. This should feel like it's growling, and he knows what it's like to have someone from Sony or Pepsi or Honda call up and say, "Oh, what we want is block rocking beats, but not get sued." Right. So he knows to understand of real world. I mean, in the age of ChatGPT, it's like, everything does it. But now, back in the day, to have someone understand you so you could use real world language to overcome my lack of kind of musical heritage, to understand what that means and then manifest it on the desk, meant that not only could we, like, so for example, I said to him, the easiest samples, I brought him the sample from, was only 999 copies, but Gladiator, which is the track that we did that's got the Gladiator sample in the middle. And I said, here's the loop, here's the sample, make it sound a little bit like Deep Dish. Right. And so the mechanics of it get structured very, very quickly. And then it's the finalization process that's key. So in perception, what I'd said was, I wanted it to be like this ginormous progressive magic trick. And the magic trick is, you think you know what it is. That's why the first break's so big, because I was like, you're selling it in that this is it. And then you dial it out. And then, as we always laughed about, like throwing the kitchen sink at something. So, well, everything, just put everything in it. And so just that stretch. And I remember we argued about, in a good way, about how long it could be. And my thing always is, if you've ever seen it, a record like that or whatever else, and it's out and it's like one of those magic moments. It's like capturing all of the fish in the net, and you see the whole audience get tuned in, and it builds and it builds and it builds. I found this on the web. And I think that, from our perspective, was the discussion that we had. Like, I knew I wanted something at the beginning that felt like it was going to lead you one way, and then the record goes in another way. And I think, especially, again, strength to peak was, how do you, when you've had a break that long, how do you legitimize the amount of time you've made people wait? Normally it's either like a combination of three things. You either go and give yourself a beat or two and then just come back with a kick or a loop. And, that's a kind of very art bat like approach where you don't throw everything over the top. You throw absolutely everything at the top and the cannons come off and da da da. And so trying to find a combination of, he was able to compress that bass, analog style. So when that bass comes in finally after that big break, you're like, this was worth the wait. And it's easy to say, and it's difficult to produce. So, I kind of set that benchmark for him. So for him to kind of bring it to the table goes to show you just, how lucky I was to work with Pete for as long as I was.
I think looking back, the quality of that track, I mean, there's so much that you just explained there that I want to revisit, but the quality of that track to me is represented by its inclusion on two kind of era-defining compilations of different scenes. You had the original version on Sasha GU13 Ibiza, but
Yeah.
then you also have the vocal version on Tiesto's In Search of Sunrise too.
Yeah.
Um, looking at the comments surrounding the track, it's unanimous that that track is an all-time favorite amongst clubbers, but each clubber has a very strong opinion, and I didn't realize it was so polarizing about which version they enjoyed most. How did two different versions of this one track come to be and find a home on two of the most important mix compilations ever made?
I think I'll be honest. For me, I much prefer the original. But we were lucky enough to sign a deal that then, as the record, like it sold,
Yeah.
Sold a lot of copies, and I think that was because people saw that it was potentially, they were able to take it in another direction with the inclusion of a vocal. And I will openly admit, at that stage, with it being one of the first things, out the gate, I think in review, it's always easy in hindsight to ask yourself, would you have followed a more artistically moral approach and said, we like it the way it is, thank you very much, we'll leave it? But at that stage, there was the option to sign it for a reasonable amount of money to a much larger label. And you don't realize, in the infancy of your career, that you're signing away a lot of your rights associated with that, including any final say on what the vocal sounds like, who can produce it, who can add it. So it feels kind of slightly churlish to say, oh, lovely, I loved taking the money, but I hate the output. But maybe it's in that area.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And also, this is like I mean, hindsight is so tough in this scene because who could have ever predicted that the sound and industry would commercially explode
Yeah.
right around that time in the way it did?
Yeah.
It's like it may have not even been on your mind at that point.
Well, I was just at a stag do when the DJ played. Who are the people who did Perfect Motion? And he played the song. It's always got to be 30 years
Oh,
old.
is it? I know a sunscreen.
That's it, right? I mean, I'm pretty sure that was a top 10 hit.
Yeah,
but he played the extended long version. I'm pretty sure, I've heard, the likes of Dave Seaman and Papa and this and that.
It was on Renaissance. It was on the first Renaissance mix. Yeah,
there you go. Right. So, and yet, it sounded like, obviously there was a real heartfelt, kind of moment when it came on, but I was just like, this record does not sound out of place.
Yeah,
it doesn't. That's the thing. I think my issue with it is that there's a vocal on a record that I think probably is a bit more kind of not radio friendly, but a bit more comprehensive in terms of how well those parts are put together. I think the vocal version, the Perception, for example, feels like what it is, which is a record that was one thing and kind of maybe has been Frankensteined slightly into being, a much bigger kind of enterprise than was originally planned. But again, I'm not down on it. It's just as you indicated, people have a preference, and I know which mine is.
Yeah. Well, the other thing you talked about the track was that it was kind of a track that you threw the kitchen sink at, and you included so many different elements in, jam-packed it. For me, the first time I ever heard the track, this is a really special experience for me, was in probably hour 14 or 15 of a 16-hour Danny Tenaglia marathon set at
Brilliant.
Stereo. Now,
Oh, in
Danny
Montreal.
in Montreal, and
Yeah.
Danny has the ability to take these tracks that have so many amazing sonic elements in it and extend it out. And I think he played a custom edit of the track that lasted upward like over 15 minutes long. But it was a true
He
it's like
probably
one of
just
those
played it at
things.
minus. He probably just played it at -8.
No, no, I mean the way he DJs with firing in his stems and things like
Yeah.
that, but it was just before we started the interview, we were talking about the way with progressive tracks, how you're not sure if it's one track or you're not sure if it's three different tracks.
Yeah.
And in the way that Danny played it, like you were saying, how different DJs can play different tracks in different ways. It was an entire journey. He breaks down his stereo marathons into these different sections, and it felt like that single track was its own section. It was unbelievably cool.
I I actually spoke to him recently for the first time in a decade, about we were having a production discussion about something which will potentially be coming out in the next year. And yeah, I just again, there was another one of those elements where someone who I'd always held in high regard, but on the few occasions when I got to meet him, I was just like, I absolutely love this guy to death. That's always such a powerful combination. I think when um, you have a love of someone and then find that in return they're also lovely with it.
Oh,
That's
absolutely.
mental. That feels like you don't never meet your heroes, and sometimes that's true because you know you kind of you're in love with the archetype of what it is that they do. They deliver excellence in a forum or an art form in which you are also a small player. It's like playing sort of football with Messi and then discovering that he's going to take everyone to Nando's afterwards. Yeah.
I
So
think
he mentioned that. What's funny that you say that because I was like, oh, where have you played recently that was amazing? And obviously when he and I hung out on a few occasions, or he was very much New York based, like he didn't travel, and now that he's really changed that. And but stereo was his number one. Like he made it quite clear. The
yeah.
long, drawn out, exploratory, I think was the word he used. And it's interesting that you say that he enjoys compartmentalizing it in a good way, so that he can, push the boat out in all of the things that he does without feeling he's shortchanged anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really cool. As a reporter on the scene, what you said about it kind of defies the idiom of don't meet your heroes. I think it's one of the things that has allowed the progressive scene to not only be ever present throughout the history of kind of electronic music, but also be in such a strong place after the pandemic is because I found that at these gigs where now more than ever people are striving for human to human interaction, the DJs especially the old guard, do an unbelievable job of making themselves accessible in some ways to the people that support them. For me as a reporter, it's everyone being down like yourself to do an extended interview and share these amazing stories. But even at the gigs themselves, fans not being nervous or afraid to go up with an album and say
Yeah.
why this meant so much to them. And I think and the DJs being so gracious about it and willing to speak with them on the spot about that project or that album or memories that the clubbers may have. I think it's one of the strongest things that keeps this scene so close knit and why it's still, I just think it's having a great moment right now after the pandemic because of that.
It was one of my favorite things. Like Norm put me onto a Facebook group. I don't really use Facebook, but he put me
Yeah.
on a Facebook group, and it was just there was one where there was a thread of all the people who had records that I had signed when I was on tour, and I just said stupid things like, "Next time, please have clothes on, Kaz." da 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 da, please stop calling, da, da, you know, just. But then one person had said, like, you know, just there were acetates for things or things that I had that nobody else had, like the thing, the Kate Bush thing that, you know, I was in the studio with Jamie, or this is his record, but, you know, I helped him map out the Kate Bush, you know, bootleg and stuff like that. And just, you know, I remember wanting, you know, more than gladly handing these things over, because you really got the feeling that there was a sense of magic, that there was a sense of people were super, super appreciative of the fact that you'd come alone. You know, that already was a great benchmark. But then that you, as you say, you took the time afterwards just to hang out, talk about music, you know, maybe sign something, share it, whatever it was. Yeah, it's just an absolute pleasure. And all of the people that I think you referenced and everything else, I found that to be the case, you know, in my interactions with them. And that also made it, you know, a very enjoyable artistic space to play in.
I want to be respectful of your time. There's so much we could talk about. I would like to go back to the beginning of your career because there was a few things that you mentioned. One, I'm really curious about how this iconic partnership between you and Slide, as I know him, came to be.
Yeah,
And the other thing is, if you can speak a little bit about Flying Rhino was the label that you mentioned.
yeah,
I
that's
believe. Can you give me kind of a history lesson on that? Because in these interviews, in real time, I'm trying to connect the dots, and Flying Rhino is
it's
something I've
really easy.
seen over and over. Yeah, go ahead.
Really, really, really simple. It speaks to what we had spoken about before, which is it's difficult. I've got four kids. You know, all of them are different, obviously, but in the main, most of them have some sort of creative passion and all the rest of it. And I'm like, you've just got to be in it. Like, and if you're in it, you're doing things that will feel like a win. You know, if you're worried that it's not the thing, like if you want to be Chris Nolan and you never do anything because you're not Chris Nolan, you'll never become Chris Nolan. Like the Russo brothers, I think Joe Russo came, who I'm a big fan of, although their post Marvel work hasn't been great. But I love them as individuals. I love Joe Russo. He said, if you want to be a carpenter, you're going to have to make 10,000 shitty tables. That's how you can charge 10,000 for one table. Right. So I love that concept. So when I was working, this was post university, I was DJing a little bit, just very small gigs, the usual friends, extended friends and stuff like that. And I just was in every possible way back then, pre-internet, just looking, or not pre-internet, but
Yeah.
95, I was just looking for anything that was involved in electronic music. And it literally was like, so this back in the day, the Guardian newspaper used to have a very, very, like if you wanted a job in the BBC, you went through the Guardian. That's how, that's where they logged it. So it was kind of anything and everything. Like I applied to be, you know, DJ on Radio 1, anything at all, runner, this, that, anything. And I remember one day there was a tiny little rectangular advert with like the Flying Rhino logo on it, said that they were looking for like a label manager. And I obviously had no, you know, historical skills as concerns that. But I went and I said to them, I said, I think there's a really great way to take this music and to make it relevant ongoing. Like again, talking about Danny, that's one of the nicest things that anyone's ever done. So it was I'm pretty sure it was in DJ Magazine. It will be on the internet somewhere. And somebody said, hey, you know, who's doing cool stuff and da-da-da-da. Out of the blue, he just wrote, I really like what Cass is doing at Flying and the rest of the guys at Flying Rhino. That was that was huge back in the day when something like that in print really meant something. And somebody sent me that. And I was like, mind blown. Okay. So again, you know, my thing always is, how can we retain what everybody loves about this, but maybe ask questions that are like, you know, because it was the first thing. Again, I saw Danny just a few months ago and just remember, like, you know, just reaching out to him and saying, hey, I know that in the past, maybe you've enjoyed this music, even if it's not all for you, but what I want is a house remix. And I saw the opportunity to, you know, you hope retain the kind of fan base that exists there and push, not completely altruistically, I grant you, the label in a direction that I felt was more kind of the way I wanted. And then Pete had released a record there, and I heard in it a lot that I really loved. And I said, would you be interested in going to the studio or making something? And that's how that started. But just even though, yeah, I think it's interesting. You see it from a parental point of view, where it's like, isn't it worse? Like we often have a discussion, as a family. We're like, what do we think? If you're a really big child actor in a TV show and you get 5 great seasons, but then that's it, is it better to have had 5 great seasons doing something that you love or not? It's difficult,
Yeah.
and I don't have an answer. But so am I sapped that I didn't continue and everything else? Yes, yeah, absolutely. But I also think about all of the opportunities, all the things I've done outside of that. And like I told you, like that one mix, or the time that we were at Renaissance at the Q Club in Birmingham, and I just looked at my friends and was like, just not sure it will ever get better than this. Some narcotics may have been involved. And it's like it's not one of those things where you're just like, those are treasured memories. And to have it all, I think, as you put it, whether it's post-COVID or not, that sense of community, that sense of kind of, togetherness and shared passion about something, just being in and around it does feel special. It does
Yeah.
feel special. So, to go full circle, to come back to it, and we've signed a couple of records to Nick Warren's label. Hanan, when I asked him, he's I don't know if Norman's allowed, if I could even tell you, he's going to be remixing a track which is coming out for a special release to sell, for a big celebration for Norman's strip label, which I'm kind of because the reason I hooked up with Norm is he was the first person to ever sell me records.
Nice.
I think I was 18 at the time, so we've known each other for well over 3 decades. So yeah, again, just sharing passion with people that you laugh with and who you have a shared heritage with, in whatever small format. It just holistically feels very cool.
Yeah, man. Well, I just want to thank you for taking the time to
Oh, dude,
speak.
I've had a blast.
Yeah, yeah, no, this was awesome, and I'm sure I know that there's going to be stories about tracks and other stuff that my listeners are going to be furious that I didn't answer, but I look forward to another conversation in the future where we can continue. I'll take in the feedback, and there'll be a whole nother round of questions in the future. But this was really really cool and really inspiring for me. So thank you, man.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, I'd already seen some of your bits and pieces and everything else, and I think that kind of, you know, modern kind of display and that kind of, integration, as you said, with the artists themselves, who themselves are passionate and open to sharing, is the very best of kind of modern media, right? That kind of access was something that you never would have had before. You never would have had that coverage. You never would have been able to grab, Hanan 5 minutes after he finished 5 hours at Loveland with Nick and then say, can we just sit down for half an hour? And if he's got the time and he doesn't have to, he's not on his way to a airport, most times people like that will be like, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that, again, because I think also that they see, you're part of the expansion of the remit, and I think that's, you spoke to the music before. I think that's what's relevant is it's as enjoyable to hear this music in a dark space with a great sound system for 300 people as it is to be stood in a field listening to it with 30,000 people.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's quite unique. Again, obviously there will be some variations, but in the main, that's quite unique. Because you think about house music, it needs a sweatbox, right? It doesn't necessarily translate in the same way. But this room can feel big. This music genre, again, it speaks to the artistry of the person in control, but this genre can feel really, really big, but it can also feel inordinately intimate, and sometimes both at the same time. And that really is pretty special.
It's how I fell in love with this music. It wasn't going to the clubs. It was going on long drives with one of my friends and putting in a global underground and being like, holy shit. Like this music that's made for a club feels like it's speaking or it just feels like it was meant to be listened to on this long car ride through the
Yeah,
Rocky Mountains or something like that.
I think they just put Renaissance, the first one, on the streaming. And I was when we were talking about it, and the kids, because obviously we've tried to bring the kids up with the usual self-respecting parentals. So it's a lot of Marvin Gaye, a lot of Stevie Wonder, a lot of but also Chemical Brothers, Underworld, Bicep, etc., etc., etc. So they've had that sort of combination, and they can see how we talk about it. So there's that shared passion. In my daughter, for example, now it's flipped on its head. So she's a really good DJ, but she plays like stuff like Kendrick and SZA and like Frank Ocean and things like that, which then get we're now I'm hold my hand up and go, is Swim Good my favorite song from the last 10 years? Maybe it is. She's the one who just kept playing it. So she will DJ from her phone, like dinners, like just the family dinner. And it just kept appearing on. And I'm like, this record is just unreal. And then, and that itself, just anything in and around it doesn't need to be a work thing, but just any kind of collaboration, especially parentally and music wise, it's really quite emotional. And that's what I always remember being the best of this kind of thing was you were, it just made you feel really, really passionate. And those are the times that you remember, for sure.
Thank you so much, man. This was really awesome. I wish you good luck on the release of Gothmania,
Thank you. I
with
really
Norman
appreciate it.
Unstripped. And yeah, well, I hope to meet in person soon, but if not, we'll definitely be speaking
100%.
again. So
If we will speak offline, but when the schedules allow, I'll bring my, sort of creative agency, skill set to bear. We can then do it. We'll do a live together.
yeah,
And
yeah, it'd be awesome.
we'll do a live together, and then we will continue and pick up, like my favorite Ken Robinson, from TED speech, where his two speeches are 4 years apart. When he starts the second one, he goes, "As I was saying."
That's awesome. Yeah, that's perfect. So yeah, man, I hope you have a great day and thank you so
Cool.
much.
Take care, man. Bye.
Bye.